I only have 5 points to make, first of all. The first one, Minister, is to thank you for coming in here tonight. I guess there's huge demands on your time at the moment, particularly today when we see the extraordinary events across the RIC. So your presence here this evening is very much appreciated and it's duly noted. I'd also like just to put on the record that I'm very grateful for the very positive engagement we've had over the last couple of weeks and months. And I'm far more hopeful now than I was even 3 months ago that we can finally get to grips with the problems in the Defence Forces and push on and move on from there. The second point I'd like to mention is in relation to the legislation itself. I have no difficulty with the legislation. I'm very happy to support it. As you did mention, though, it is just housekeeping. I can understand from a legality point of view why you might want to enshrine it and codify it in primary legislation, but the reality is it's not going to change anything on the ground at all. And I think we could have added a few more amendments in, and I'm just going to give you a few suggestions that you might wish to consider. Because I think this is what this chamber is all about, that we make minor adjustments at the top and they have huge and disproportionately positive effects downstream. And the first thing I would say is, from a Reserve Defence Force point of view, we should have about 4,000 people in the Reserve Defence Force, and we have about 1,000 effective. So if you try to run a school with 25% of your teachers, or try to run a hospital with 25% of your nurses, it's just mission impossible. So I think we really need to focus on the reserve. A lot of people don't realise is we call them the Defence Forces for a reason, and it's plural for a reason, because they consist of the Permanent Defence Force and the Reserve Defence Force. And I think the next group of amendments that we pushed through in the Defence Act 1954 should be focused, I won't say exclusively, but primarily on the reserve. And let me give you some examples. So I think the first thing that should happen is we should legislate to allow our Reserve Defence Force to serve overseas. In niche operation roles like medical and communications in particular. So they should be able to serve operationally. They should also be able to go on training exercises and training courses abroad. And thirdly, they should be able to go and participate in ceremonial events abroad. So that's the first thing I would say. Allow the reserve to travel overseas for those 3 reasons. I think they will certainly take themselves far more seriously if we take themselves more seriously as well. So there are 3 things that would make a huge difference, and would make a huge difference overnight, unlike the legislation that we have here in front of us, which is all well and good, but it doesn't impact anything on the ground. The second thing I would say from a reserve perspective, because we know how understrength they are, is you quite rightly brought in legislation, and your predecessor did as well, in relation to re-enlistment of personnel into the PDF, the Permanent Defence Force. I suppose my suggestion would be, why don't we allow for re-enlistment of personnel into the Reserve Defence Force? So Reserve Defence Force people who have left, there's no harm in bringing them back in as well if they're a good fit for the organisation. And the third thing I would say is, for people like myself who recently retired from the Permanent Defence Force, I think it should be a seamless transition back into the Reserve Defence Force if the person is interested. It should just really be a box-ticking exercise that I'm very interested in serving in the Reserve, and off we go from there. And I think those 3 measures would have a huge impact on the Reserve Defence Force within 24 hours. You'd populate the numbers very, very quickly, and very, very quickly you get back up towards 4,000. So they're the 3, I guess, amendments I would consider from a reserve perspective. From a Permanent Defence Force perspective, and this is a real bone of contention, it's an issue that can be very easily solved as well, but there is a provision in the Defence Act 1954 which means that a soldier who doesn't serve their full 5-year term has to purchase their discharge. And again, it's a 1954 Act for good reason, because a provision like that has no place in modern employment legislation, no place whatsoever. So private soldiers and TDs have one real thing in common, that they both sign up for a 5-year term. So if I resign my seat voluntarily now and walk out of here, I will get a golden handshake. If a private soldier does not complete their full 5-year term, they get handed a bill for €300, which is completely scandalous. And it can be very easily changed and will have a huge impact on morale. So that's the second thing I would like to say. The third thing I would like to focus on is non-legislative amendments which would make a huge difference. And I just have 5 of them to throw out there. The first one is naval pay. So pay for the Navy, additional pay. And I think the Minister has done a lot of work on that in the last couple of months. And hopefully we're looking towards having a very positive announcement in the next couple of weeks. We know how bad things are in the Navy. I've mentioned it before. There's no point in mentioning it again. But a very, very small difference would be to improve the pay, and you will have hugely positive effects overnight, immediately. The second thing I'd say is about the quarantine money. So the troops, because of COVID, who are serving overseas, they're brought into barracks for an additional 2 weeks' work before they deploy overseas for 6 months. So they don't get to see their families for 6.5 months. They should be getting some additional pay for the quarantine that they're doing for 2 weeks before they travel. And it's a major bone of contention for the people in Syria and in Lebanon at the moment. People's spouses had to give up their work for 2 weeks, so the family is down salary. So if there's anything you could do from that perspective, Minister, particularly if it can be done in the next couple of weeks, it would be hugely, hugely appreciated and have a very positive effect on morale. As mentioned by the Social Democrat speaker, the technical pay issue was announced with great fanfare on the 4th of July from the plinth by the Minister for Finance at the time, who's still the Minister for Finance, and the Super Junior for Defence. And I presume that they gave those announcements in good faith. That was over 16 months ago now. And I know it's probably an unfair comparison to make, but it's a comparison nonetheless, that we are currently taking issue with the British government, who entered into an agreement that they're now claiming not to want to honour. The government entered into an agreement with the Defence Forces and the representative associations in good faith on the 4th of July last year, and it's now up to our government to honour that commitment. We're not talking about big money at all. A commitment was made and it should be followed through on. And there is no risk of contagion to other parts of the public service. If there was risk of contagion, it would have happened on the 4th of July last year when it was announced. Because the technical pay hasn't been implemented at this stage, we've had huge hemorrhage of paramedics, mechanics and technically qualified people. And again, a small adjustment could make a hugely positive impact on the ground. The fourth thing I'd like to say is a very positive sentence on the programme for government, and it commits this government to providing the same level of medical care to enlisted personnel as to commissioned officers. Now, Minister, if you're looking for something which could be very quickly implemented, and that could be very quickly implemented next week, which will have a huge effect on morale and demonstrate something tangible for the troops, providing private medical care to enlisted personnel who are injured, as you do to the commissioned officers, would make a huge difference. It's very, very simply done. The medical officer, instead of writing down Captain X on the form, just puts down Corporal Y, and they should have exactly the same access to medical care. We have a number, about over 100 personnel at the moment who are on long-term sick leave awaiting operations because they've injured their back, they've damaged their knees, they've torn ligaments, and they're languishing at home for months on the public waiting list. If we could get them expedited back into the ranks, it would make a huge difference. And also, the enlisted personnel have to pay for their own treatment even though they're injured at work. And that would encourage them to litigate. So if the Defence Forces and the Department of Defence are actually paying for their medical treatment, there'll be no requirement to litigate. So that's another measure which would make a huge difference on the ground. And the last thing I'd like to mention from a non-legislative perspective would be the budget, and it's coming up on the 13th of October. Traditionally, the Defence Forces always get the lowest level of increase. And not only that, but the majority of that increase over the last 5 years in particular have gone into paying Defence Forces pensions. And the reason that has taken place is because of the very poor policies that were pursued over the last few years, which have driven loads of people out of the Defence Forces against their will, and the pensions bill has risen. So if there's anything you can do from a budgeting perspective that the Defence Forces can get their fair share, it'll be hugely appreciated. And I think from an infrastructural point of view, and I know you were very good to visit the Curragh camp recently, and I know the Count Corla will verify the veracity of what I'm saying, but the Curragh camp is most likely, even though it's a wonderful place full of wonderful people, it is the most derelict town in the entire country, bar none. And I challenge anybody to mention any other town in the country that it has such poor infrastructure. It's not just an army barracks, it's a functioning town with 2 primary schools and a secondary school. So I think if there's anything can be done from an infrastructural perspective there, it would make a huge difference. I think also we can be creative in relation to our budgeting. And I don't think all the funds should be coming from the defence votes. I think there's a lot of housing on the camp in the Curragh that could very easily be funded through the Department of Housing. And perhaps you could liaise with your colleagues at the Cabinet table and see, is there any funding from the housing budget that could be routed towards the Curragh from that perspective? And secondly, we must also remember that it is a college. It is a third-level institution. It is an international third-level institution taking students from abroad. And we have a brand new government department of further and higher education, research, innovation and science. It's a brand new department with a complete blank canvas. So if there's any funding from that department that could be funneled towards Defence Forces training institutions, that's certainly a possibility as well. The fourth thing I'd like to mention is our new Secretary General, Miss Jackie McCrum. I think it's a wonderful announcement that we have an external candidate as Secretary General. I've heard nothing but positive comments as to her attitude and performance to date. I think it's a huge plus that her most recent job was working in the Department of Social Protection, where she had to devise and advertise and implement social protections for people who are struggling. And I think her appointment is to be hugely welcomed. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that her appointment has the potential to have the same effect as the likes of Matthew Elderfield during the financial crisis when he came in to work with the financial regulator, or Professor Patrick Honohan when he came in to work with the central bank. So there's huge potential and there's huge hope out there, and I very much look forward to working with Secretary General McCrum over the next number of years. And finally, just to conclude, because I'm conscious of the clock, I used to sit up there actually, Minister, when I was a soldier here on guard duty, guarding the Leinster House campus about 20 years ago in happier times. And I do remember being here one night and seeing your dad actually as Minister for Defence, and I never thought for a moment that I'd actually have to come into the chamber here and have to advocate for very basic living standards for service personnel and their families. And I think it's wonderful to close the circle basically, and to be able to address another member of the Coveney clan from that perspective. I presume you're the only family who've both dad and son have occupied the position of Minister for Defence. So just to sum up, I'd be very, very happy to say that I hope you regard me as definitely being on your side. We really want you to be a very successful Defence Minister, because I think if you have a successful ministry, then the Defence Forces will be very successful, and the country will be very successful as well. And I very much look forward to working with you over the next number of years. Thank you very much. Thank you.